All right, let's talk about a book that you've probably read in school but is so much more than just required reading. John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. It's not just a sad story, it is a perfectly engineered piece of social commentary, a kind of literary trap that feels just as tight and inescapable today as it did back in 1937. So let's dive right in and deconstruct this masterpiece.
To really get to the heart of this book's genius, we have to start right here, with this one line. It's so simple, right? A simple declaration of looking out for each other. But this idea, it's the emotional core of the entire story. It's the promise that fuels this unforgettable friendship, and honestly, it's what makes the ending so absolutely devastating.
So let's talk about the two guys at the center of it all. George Milton, who's the sharp, kind of weary caretaker, and Lennie Small, the gentle giant with incredible strength but the mind of a child. Their bond, their friendship, well, it drives everything.
And you can see this stark contrast between them, can't you? George is the brain. He's the planner, the one trying to navigate this incredibly hostile world they live in. And Lennie, he's all muscle, completely dependent on George, but he's also the only reason George isn't totally alone. Now you have to understand, in the world of migrant workers where every man was for himself, this kind of relationship wasn't just weird. It was a huge deal. It was a radical act of defiance against a world that demanded you be alone.
And the glue that held them together was this dream of a little farm. It wasn't just, a retirement plan. It was like a secret story they told each other over and over again. It was a mantra that protected them from the soul-crushing reality of their lives. But here's the thing, this deeply personal dream was a direct reaction to the massive historical forces that were just grinding an entire nation into dust.
To really get what George and Lennie were up against, we have to zoom out, way out. Their story doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It takes place right in the middle of 1930s America, a world that Steinbeck knew firsthand, inside and out.
And you see, it wasn't just one bad thing. It was a total perfect storm of disaster. First, the stock market crashes in '29, kicking off the Great Depression. Then, a catastrophic drought hits, turning the Great Plains into what we now call the Dust Bowl. This cascade of economic and ecological collapse triggered the largest internal migration in American history. Think about that number for a second. An estimated 2.5 million people were just uprooted, driven from their homes in states like Oklahoma and Arkansas. And a lot of them, just like George and Lennie, headed west to California, which was being advertised by big agricultural companies as this kind of promised land, a place with endless jobs and opportunity.
But the reality they found? Oh, it was a nightmare. The wages were so low, you literally couldn't survive. They lived in these filthy camps along irrigation ditches with zero sanitation. Disease was everywhere. And on top of all that, they were met with this incredible hatred, branded with the slur Okies, and treated like they were less than human. It was a system built on brutal exploitation.
Okay, and this is where it gets really brilliant, because Steinbeck didn't just write a story about a trap. He built one with the book itself. The very structure of this novella is a work of absolute genius, designed to make you, the reader, feel just as claustrophobic and doomed as the characters.
He actually called it a play novelette, so think of it like a book that's already a script for a play. The action is trapped in just a few locations, like sets on a stage, and the narrator almost never tells us what characters are thinking. He just tells us what they do and say. So we're forced to just sit there and watch, like an audience, as this tragedy unfolds.
And this structure, it hammers home this central theme of futility. The story is a perfect circle. It begins by the riverbank, this little spot of peace and safety, and it ends in the exact same spot, only now the dream is completely shattered. They run and they struggle, only to end up right back where they started. Nothing is changed.
So what's the big idea here? Well, this structure plugs right into a literary tradition called naturalism. And the core idea of naturalism is that people are not in control of their own destinies. They're doomed by two massive forces, their internal nature, their heredity, and their external world, their environment. So for Lennie, his gentle soul mixed with his uncontrollable strength, dropped into the cruel, unforgiving environment of the ranch, tragedy isn't just a possibility, it's completely inevitable.
And George and Lennie, they weren't the only ones trapped on this ranch. Not by a long shot. The whole place is like a miniature version of a broken society, filled with this constellation of characters, and every single one of them represents a different kind of loneliness.
Just look.
You've got Candy, pushed to the side because of his age and his disability, absolutely terrified that he's about to be thrown out like trash. Then there's Crooks, isolated by vicious racism, forced to live by himself just because he's black. And of course, Curly's wife, the only woman on the entire ranch. She doesn't even get a name. She's just an object, completely trapped by sexism. Each one has a broken dream, and each one is profoundly, painfully alone.
Man, this quote from Crooks, it just cuts right to the bone, doesn't it? He gets it. He understands that loneliness isn't just a sad feeling you have. In their world, it's a social disease. It's a sickness that is actively created and enforced by the systems of racism, ageism, and raw economic exploitation that run their lives.
Okay, so let's put it all together. With all this context, the history, the story structure, the lonely characters, we can finally unpack the novella's biggest symbols and see how they are a direct critique of one of America's most foundational myths.
That little farm they dream of? That is the American dream in a nutshell, right? The idea that if you just work hard enough, you can get your own piece of land, be your own boss, live off the fat of the land. But what Steinbeck does is he just pulls the rug out from under that whole idea, exposing it as a cruel fantasy, at least for people like George and Lennie. The dream's real power wasn't that it was possible, it was in the telling of the story. It was therapy. It was a soothing bedtime story that made an unbearable life just survivable.
And the title itself, man, it tells you everything you need to know. It's a reference to a Robert Burns poem about a farmer who accidentally plows over a mouse's nest, destroying its home. The famous line means that the best laid plans of mice and men often go wrong. By choosing this title, Steinbeck is basically telling us from the cover that this entire story is about how powerless we all are, whether we're mice or men, against the giant, crushing, and completely indifferent forces of fate.
So how did he pull this off? How did he create this overwhelming feeling of doom right from the start? Well, he used masterful foreshadowing. Little events happen all along the way that hint at the disaster to come, but there's one incident in particular that serves as a chilling, full-scale dress rehearsal for the story's climax.
The shooting of Candy's old dog. The dog is old, he smells bad, he's no good to himself, they say, and so he's taken out and shot in the back of the head, and they call it a mercy. This single act establishes the brutal, cold-hearted math of this world. If you are no longer useful, you are disposable. Period. And that horrific event is a direct parallel to George's final, impossible, heart-wrenching choice with Lennie. When Slim, who's really the moral compass of the story, says this to George at the end, he's confirming that this wasn't an act of choice or free will. It was a tragic necessity. It was an act of mercy forced on him by a world that gave him no other way out.
Which brings us to the big question, right? Why does this dark, bleak story, written almost a century ago, still get read so much? Why is it still debated and even banned with such passion today?
Because it's so much more than just a story. It's a searing takedown of any society that just discards its most vulnerable people. It exposes how loneliness can be used as a weapon to keep an unfair economic system in place. And maybe most of all, it's this powerful, timeless meditation on our desperate, absolutely sacred need to connect with each other in a world that so often seems designed to break us apart.
In the end, Of Mice and Men doesn't really give us any easy answers. Instead, it leaves us with this profound, really uncomfortable question, a question that hits just as hard today. What is our responsibility to the weak, to the lonely, to the marginalized? And how different, really, are the forces they face today? Answering that question for ourselves, well, that's the book's true legacy. And that's what makes it as vital and as necessary now as it has ever been.